They tied the paralyzed Apache girl to the rancher's mailbox as a joke, but he took her in and Asha had always been strong, but that strength had been tested in ways no one could imagine. She had once been full of life, racing across the fields, running with the wind like the other children in her Apache community. But that was before the incident that changed everything. Now her legs were useless, and she had to rely on a wheelchair to move from place to place. It was a cruel twist of fate, one that left her stuck in a place she couldn't escape from. But Asha wasn't the type to give up. She had grown up with the wisdom of her people, the Apache teachings that told her to keep going no matter how hard life became. Yet no matter how hard she tried to push forward, the stares, the whispers, and the cruel remarks of others made it impossible to forget the fact that she was different. Asha lived in a small, tight-knit Apache community, nestled deep in the heart of the desert. The people were proud, strong, and independent, but they were also close-knit. And sometimes that closeness could be suffocating. Everyone knew everyone's business. Everyone was quick to judge. It wasn't easy being someone like Asha who didn't quite fit into the mold. She didn't mind the quiet stares, but the whispers were different. They followed her everywhere she went. It was as if people couldn't understand why someone like her was still alive. It was as if her disability made her invisible, like she didn't matter. Her family had tried to protect her, of course, but there was only so much they could do. In the end, it wasn't enough. She felt abandoned in the world, even by those who had once promised to care for her. Asha's days were mostly spent in solitude. She would sit by the window, looking out over the dry desert landscape, watching the wind whip through the trees and imagining what it might be like to run again. Her world had become small, and there was little left in it that sparked any excitement. She longed for the freedom of movement she had once known, but every time she tried to move forward, the weight of her condition kept pulling her back. One day, things changed. It started off like any other. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty roads. Asha sat by the window as she always did, listening to the sounds of the world outside. Her mind wandered as it often did, but that day, something felt different. She heard voices coming from outside her house, loud and taunting. A group of ranchers had arrived, men she had known her entire life. They were the kind of men who believed in hard work, in strength, and in power. They prided themselves on their toughness, their ability to handle whatever life threw at them. But to Asha, they were just more of the same. They looked at her as if she was weak, as if she didn't deserve the same respect as everyone else. They were laughing. Asha didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. She could feel their eyes on her, the way they looked at her wheelchair, at her frailty, like it was something to be mocked. At first, she tried to ignore it. She had become used to their cruel humor, their teasing. But as she listened more closely, she realized this was different. This wasn't the kind of joke that passed quickly. This one had a purpose. Without warning, the ranchers grabbed her wheelchair and wheeled her outside, toward the road where the mailboxes stood. Asha's heart raced. She could feel the sweat forming on her brow as her body tensed. What were they doing? She tried to speak, to tell them to stop, but they ignored her. Laughter rang out in the air as they tied her to the mailbox. They didn't care that she was helpless, that she couldn't fight back. It was as if she were just an object to be used for their amusement. "Look at her," one of the men jeered, his voice loud and mocking. "She's not even good for anything else." "Let's see if she can get loose from this." Asha's heart sank. She tried to move, to break free from the ropes they had tied around her, but it was no use. Her body was useless. She couldn't even feel her legs anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough over the years. She had cried for the loss of her old life, for the loss of her independence, for the way people treated her. But she wasn't going to cry for them, not now. She was stronger than that. The laughter continued, echoing in her ears. But just as she began to feel as if she might break, a voice called out, a deep, calm voice that cut through the noise like a knife. "That's enough." The ranchers turned, surprised. They hadn't expected anyone to intervene, least of all John Ellis. John was known in the community for his quiet demeanor and his love for hard work. He was a man who didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. His ranch sat on the outskirts of the community, far from the gossip and the bickering of the others. He wasn't the type to engage in the cruelty that some of the ranchers seemed to take pleasure in. He had been watching from a distance, seeing what the others couldn't. He wasn't a fool. He knew what they were doing to Asha, and he couldn't stand it. With a few long strides, he was at her side. The ranchers fell silent, suddenly unsure of themselves. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like John. But John didn't care about their discomfort. He cared about what was right. Without a word, he untied the ropes that bound Asha to the mailbox. He didn't look at the others. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for him. "Let's get you out of here," John said softly, his voice low and steady. Asha didn't know what to say. She was in shock, unsure if what was happening was real. But before she could protest, John gently helped her into his truck, lifting her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time in a long time, Asha felt a sense of hope. She had no idea where John was taking her, but it didn't matter. She had a feeling that, for the first time in her life, someone actually cared. As the truck rumbled down the road, leaving behind the mocking laughter of the ranchers, Asha closed her eyes and let herself breathe. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. John's truck rumbled along the dusty road, its engine cutting through the silence. Asha sat quietly beside him, still in a state of shock. Her mind was spinning. Just hours ago, she had been tied to the mailbox like some forgotten object. Now, she was sitting next to a man she barely knew, a man who had done something that no one in the community had ever done for her. He had stood up for her. He had shown her kindness when everyone else had turned away. Asha didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much of her life keeping her feelings to herself, building walls to protect herself from the cruelty of others. She wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to being cared for. It felt strange, almost like she was in a dream. John didn't say much during the drive. He seemed content to let the sound of the truck's engine fill the space between them. Asha glanced at him from time to time, taking in his features, the way his rough hands gripped the wheel, his weathered face, the quiet confidence in his posture. He was a man who had seen a lot in life, but he wasn't one to talk about it. His kindness spoke louder than any words he could say. The truck turned off the main road, heading down a smaller path that wound through the dry landscape. Asha had never been this far out of the community before. She had heard rumors about John's ranch, but she had never imagined she would be coming here. The ranch appeared over the horizon, a large, open area with a few buildings scattered across it. The land was rugged, with rolling hills and patches of desert shrubbery. It was peaceful, far from the noise of the town, far from the eyes of those who judged her. It was the kind of place that made Asha feel like she could finally breathe again. John parked the truck in front of a small cabin. The ranch was modest but well kept, with animals grazing in the fields and fences stretching across the horizon. There was a sense of calm here that Asha hadn't felt in a long time. She could hear the distant sounds of horses and cows, the wind rustling through the trees, and the faint chirping of birds. It was a world so different from the one she had known. "Come on," John said, turning off the engine and getting out of the truck. He walked around to Asha's side and opened the door, offering his hand. "Let's get you settled inside." Asha hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had always been independent, even before her accident. She had taken care of herself and had never relied on anyone. But in that moment, she realized that she couldn't do everything on her own anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone help her. She took John's hand and allowed him to help her out of the truck. The cool breeze hit her face, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. It felt good to be somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Inside the cabin, it was simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a couple of chairs by a fireplace, and a worn couch in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves of books and old photos. A small table sat in the middle of the room, covered with a faded cloth. It wasn't much, but it felt warm and welcoming. John led her to one of the chairs and helped her sit down. "You can rest here for a bit," he said gently. "I'll get you some food. You must be hungry." Asha looked up at him, her mind still reeling. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know how to act around him. He was so kind, so patient. It was a stark contrast to the harshness she had experienced in the community. He didn't pity her. He didn't treat her like someone broken. He treated her like a person. And that was something she had almost forgotten was possible. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. John smiled and nodded, his expression warm but not overbearing. "It's no trouble, just relax, you're safe here." Asha watched as he moved around the cabin, preparing a simple meal. The sound of him working, the scent of food filling the air, created a sense of calm that Asha hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She didn't feel like she had to prove herself or defend her existence. She was just here. As John set the food on the table, he sat across from her, his posture relaxed. They ate in silence for a while, the sound of their utensils the only noise in the room. Asha found herself relaxing, something she hadn't done in so long. The tension that had built up in her body over the years began to fade bit by bit. She didn't have to fight for space here. She didn't have to fight for respect. It was a strange feeling, but one she wasn't ready to let go of just yet. When they finished eating, John leaned back in his chair, looking at Asha thoughtfully. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I can tell you've been through a lot, and I want you to know that you don't have to face it alone anymore." Asha stared at him for a long moment. She had never been good at opening up to people. She had spent so much of her life building walls around herself, protecting her heart from the hurt she knew was out there. But something in John's words made her want to trust him. She didn't know why, but she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could let him in. I don't know how to thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for me in one day than anyone ever has." John shrugged, a modest smile on his face. "It's just what's right. No one should be treated the way you were, not by anyone, not ever." Asha looked down at her hands, her mind racing. The words right and kindness were foreign to her now. She had spent so many years in a world where people treated her with indifference or pity. To have someone look at her like she mattered, it was overwhelming. John didn't push her. He simply allowed her the space she needed, never rushing her to share her thoughts or feelings. Asha appreciated that. She didn't need someone to fix her. She didn't need someone to tell her everything was going to be okay. What she needed was someone to show her that she still had value, that her life still had meaning, even if she couldn't walk or run like she once had. As the evening wore on, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the ranch. Asha sat in silence, taking it all in. The peacefulness of the land, the quiet companionship with John, and the safety she felt here, it was more than she could have hoped for. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe things could get better. Days turned into weeks, and Asha found herself adjusting to life on John Ellis's ranch. The initial shock of her arrival had worn off, but the sense of peace she felt every morning when the sun rose still amazed her. The land here was vast, stretching out in every direction with its open fields, dusty roads, and grazing animals. It was a world so different from the one she had known. Here, there was no judgment, no pity, no cruel laughter. Here, there was only the stillness of the land and the quiet rhythm of everyday life. John had made it clear from the very beginning that Asha was part of his world now. There was no expectation for her to earn her place. She had already done that simply by being herself. Every morning, John would wake up early to tend to his ranch, feeding the animals, fixing fences, and making sure everything ran smoothly. Asha often watched him from the window of the cabin, fascinated by his calm, steady nature. He was never in a rush, never overwhelmed by the tasks before him. His hands worked as if they had done these things 1,000 times, and yet there was a quiet pride in his every movement. It wasn't long before Asha began to feel a sense of purpose again. Even though she couldn't walk, she still had a place on the ranch. John never treated her like she was a burden, and he never made her feel like she was in the way. Instead, he found small tasks for her to do, tasks that over time gave her a sense of accomplishment. It was the little things that made a difference. Feeding the chickens, cleaning the barn, helping to sort the mail that came to the ranch. At first, these chores felt insignificant to her, but as the days went on, she began to realize how important they were, not just to the ranch, but to her own healing. She loved the mornings when the light was soft and the world was still quiet. That was when she would go out with John to the field. He would teach her how to tend to the crops, and though she couldn't do much, she was eager to learn. The rhythm of the work, the quiet hum of life in the fields, became a kind of meditation for her. It was a way to forget the pain of her past and focus on the present. For the first time since her accident, she didn't feel like she was trapped in her own body. She didn't feel the same weight of helplessness she had carried for so long. John always had a way of making even the simplest tasks feel meaningful. One day, as they were planting seeds in the garden, he stopped for a moment and looked at her with a serious expression. "You know," he said, wiping his brow, "a lot of people think that a ranch is just about the land, the crops, the animals. But it's more than that. It's about the people who work it, the people who make it what it is. Asha turned to him, her hands covered in soil, and listened carefully. She had never thought about the ranch that way before. Everything here is connected, he continued. The land, the animals, the people, it's like a family, and I think you're starting to see that. You're part of it now, Asha. You're part of this family. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had never been part of anything like this. Her life had been filled with loss and isolation, and yet here she was, welcomed with open arms into a place that didn't judge her. Here, her disability didn't define her. Here, she was valued for who she was, not for what she could or couldn't do. As the days went by, Asha found herself growing stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. She began to understand that she wasn't broken. She wasn't a victim of her circumstances. She was a person with the ability to make a difference, even in small ways. The ranch, with its quiet, steady rhythm, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could finally let go of the hurt she had carried for so long. John's presence was a constant source of reassurance. He never asked anything of her except to be herself. And when she felt self-conscious or unsure, he was always there to remind her of her worth. His kindness was something she couldn't quite understand at first, but the longer she stayed, the more she realized how rare it was. At night, when the work was done and the ranch settled into its quiet rhythm, Asha would sit on the porch looking out over the land. The sky would be a deep shade of purple, dotted with stars. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the cool breeze from the desert carried a sense of calm. It was in these moments, when everything was still, that Asha felt truly at peace. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, John joined her, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her and sat down beside her. For a while, they said nothing. The only sound was the quiet rustling of the trees and the distant bleating of the sheep in the field. Finally, Asha broke the silence. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The life you had before all this?" John took a slow sip of his tea, looking out at the land. "Sometimes," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I've learned that life changes. We don't get to control what happens, but we get to decide how we respond to it. I've seen enough to know that things don't always go as planned, but the trick is you find a way to keep going. You find what matters and you hold on to that." Asha turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "What matters to you, John?" He looked at her then, his eyes steady and kind. "What matters is people, helping them, taking care of what needs taking care of. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. I think you're starting to see that too." Asha felt a knot in her throat. She had always believed that life was about survival, about getting through the hard times. But here, on this ranch, she was beginning to understand that life was about something more. It was about connection, about finding meaning in the small moments, and about giving love and kindness where it was needed most. John's words stuck with her long after that evening. They echoed in her mind as she worked the land, as she helped take care of the animals, as she grew stronger with each passing day. Slowly but surely, she was finding her place in the world again. It wasn't the world she had known before, the one that had once seemed so full of pain and judgment. This world was different. This world was full of possibility, of kindness, of new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, Asha allowed herself to believe that she had a future. She didn't know what it would look like, but she knew it would be hers to shape. And with John by her side, she knew she wasn't alone. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was living. The days on the ranch began to blend together, and with each passing moment, Asha felt herself growing more comfortable in her new life. The pain of her past, the memories of mockery, rejection, and isolation, still lingered, but they weren't as sharp anymore. The ranch, with its quiet beauty, was healing her in ways she hadn't imagined. She had found a place where she wasn't just tolerated, but accepted. Here, she wasn't a burden. She wasn't someone to be pitied. Here, she was a part of something real, something meaningful. John's kindness never wavered. Each day, he continued to show her that there was more to life than just surviving. His steady presence reminded her that there was value in simply being, in living with intention, and in taking each day as it came. Asha had never known life could be so simple, so peaceful. There were no expectations placed upon her here, no pressure to be anything other than who she was. That, in itself, was a gift. As the seasons passed, Asha began to take on more responsibilities around the ranch. At first, she had only helped with small tasks. feeding the animals, tending to the garden, organizing the barn. But soon, John started to trust her with more, encouraging her to learn new skills and take ownership of her role on the ranch. One morning, as Asha sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the fields, John approached her with a request. "Asha," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I'm going into town to pick up some supplies. I was wondering if you'd like to take care of the herd today. I trust you to manage them while I'm gone." Asha looked up at him, surprised. For a moment, she felt a surge of anxiety. The thought of being responsible for the herd, a job so vital to the ranch's survival, was intimidating. She wasn't used to having that kind of responsibility, especially after everything that had happened to her. But something in John's voice, something in the way he looked at her, told her that he believed in her. "You really think I can handle it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. John nodded. "I do. You've been learning the land, learning the animals. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Asha. I know you can do it." Her heart swelled with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never been given such an important task, and the thought of it filled her with both pride and doubt. But deep down, she knew that this was a moment she couldn't shy away from. If John believed in her, then maybe, just maybe, she could believe in herself too. "I'll do my best," Asha said, her voice steadying as the weight of the responsibility began to settle in. "Take your time," John said with a warm smile. "I'll be back before long. You've got this." With that, he climbed into his truck and drove off toward town, leaving Asha standing there, facing the wide-open field where the herd grazed. She took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, and rolled her wheelchair down toward the corral where the cattle were gathered. The task ahead felt huge, but Asha had come to realize that it was moments like these moments of challenge, of responsibility, that gave life its true meaning. The herd was large, their bodies thick with muscle and strength. They looked at her with wary eyes as she approached, but there was no fear in their gaze. They were used to John, and they had started to recognize Asha too. Over the past few weeks, she had learned their names, their quirks, and how to guide them with a calm presence. Today, she would be in charge, and she wasn't about to let them down. Asha began the task by guiding the herd toward the pasture. She knew the land well enough to understand the lay of the fields. She positioned herself at the front of the group, using her voice to steady the cattle and her knowledge of the terrain to keep them moving in the right direction. At first, the task seemed daunting. The animals were strong, and the open fields stretched far ahead of her, but slowly her confidence grew. The more she worked with the herd, the more she realized how much she had learned. She was no longer the fragile, helpless girl she had once been. She was a part of this place, a part of the land, the animals, and the life John had built here. By the time John returned, the herd had been safely moved to the far end of the pasture, grazing peacefully in the cool shade. Asha was sitting in her wheelchair, watching the animals with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She felt proud in a way that she hadn't felt in a long time. John pulled up to the corral, his truck kicking up dust as he parked. He stepped out and walked over to her, his eyes scanning the field. Asha turned to him, her heart racing. "You did it," John said with a smile, his voice full of pride. "I knew you could." Asha beamed, the weight of the responsibility she had carried today still settling in her chest. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but it felt good, really good." John knelt beside her, his expression softening. "That's the thing about life, Asha, it's not always easy. But the good things, the things that matter most, are worth the struggle, and you've proven that you're strong enough to face it all." Asha's eyes filled with emotion. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before. For so long, she had believed that her worth was tied to her ability to do what others could do, to walk, to run, to live like everyone else. But here, on the ranch, she was learning that her worth was not defined by what she lacked. It was defined by what she could give, by the strength she had within herself, by the love and care she could offer to those around her. "I never thought I'd be able to do something like this," Asha said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I did. And it feels like I'm finally starting to live again." John smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "You've always had that strength, Asha. It was just waiting for you to see it." As they sat there, watching the herd in the distance, Asha realized that she was no longer the girl who had been tied to a mailbox, humiliated and alone. She was stronger now, not just because she had taken care of the herd, but because she had learned to believe in herself. John had shown her that kindness, respect, and trust were the things that truly mattered. And for the first time in years, Asha felt like she had a place in the world. She was part of something bigger than herself, something that wasn't just about surviving. It was about living fully, with purpose, with meaning, and with the belief that she was enough just as she was. John had given her more than just a place to stay. He had given her a second chance, a chance to live a life that was her own, to find her strength, and to reclaim her future. And as the sun began to set over the ranch, Asha smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to discover, so much more to become. But for now, she was content. She had found her place, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace.